Okay, is it on?
It's on.
It's on. What? Is it really on? Yes, it is. Right, let's see. Did Shirley see you? Shirley Wood, yeah. What is this about? The Nordic launch?
Yep. They had buses for 200 people, so I wouldn't have money there. Yeah.
When is this? When is this taking place?
Tonight?
Oh right. Oh, I
Just
didn't know.
after we finish, you will go on the bus and they will take you to a cool place with the dinosaurs.
Really?
And to back in town by E.
So, is this who's invited? Really? I didn't see this. All right. Oh, excellent. Oops, excuse me. That's a good publicity stunt. I like that.
The OK Federation, not the UK, but the OK. Maybe.
I'm not sure if it's okay or not. No, it is. It is.
It's not okay, it's great.
It's brilliant. That's right. I've got my salesman hat on. In fact, at the moment, that's all I seem to be doing. It's like selling. It's going out to people and telling them how great.
For the first wave.
Yeah, I know. I don't mind too much because I'm not really a techie. Josh is the techie.
Good afternoon. My name is Koen Schelkens from Belnet, the Belgian Research Network, and I'm chair of this session. And I'd like to welcome you for this last session of the day and the third session in a row about identity management and federations, where the two other sessions in the morning and this afternoon were more about the technology and architecture side of federation management and identity management systems. In this session, we will focus more on how to interconnect federations and make bigger, implement them on a larger scale. We have three very interesting talks here. First of all, we have Mark Tyson from Ukerna, who will give us a view on the situation in the UK with the UK access management system. Then we have Ingrid Melve from Uninet, who will give us a nice presentation about the interconnecting the Nordic federations. And finally, we have Ken Klingenstein from Internet2, who will tell us more about how things are going in the Wild West. So I'd like to ask Mark Tyson to the floor to give this presentation about the UK Federation.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along to this event. My name's Mark Tyson. I work for the UK National Research and Education Network, Ukerna, specifically within the Authentication and Authorization team at Ukerna. And we've been responsible for rolling out the UK Federation, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Is it just me, or is there an echo I can hear? Does it sound strange? Okay, it's going to be looked into. Okay, to give you an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, this is essentially a non-technical talk. We're going to look at some of the background to authentication and authorization in the UK, then look at the UK Federation itself, some of the service components, the technical and policy framework that make up the Federation, some of the challenges that we faced in deploying the Federation, and finally, a look at where we're heading in the future. So in the school sector, access management decisions were largely based on IP address checking, resulting in ad hoc bilateral arrangements between organisations, multiple usernames and passwords, multiple copies of personal data being held by third parties, lots of duplication of effort and difficulty in sharing resources between organisations. In the HE and FE research sector, the colleges and schools, colleges and universities sector, again we had ad hoc bilateral arrangements and also the Athens service. Classic Athens is a centralised service that sees institutions providing information about their users to Athens, who act as brokers for authentication and authorization on behalf of the organisation. And once again, Athens database contains lots of information about users and the sorts of resources that they're accessing. So the situation that we're trying to move away from in the UK is demonstrated quite nicely by this little animation that I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Andrew Cormack. Typically, the service provider wants to know if this user, the web browser user in the middle there, has a license to access their content. And typically it does this by asking the user to submit a username and password, which the user does. And what the service provider finds out there is that that person is called A. Jones and their password is T, T, etc., etc. But it doesn't actually find out whether or not this user has a license. In taking this approach, the user's identity, personal data are given to the third-party service provider. As I mentioned, the publisher doesn't actually find out what it needs to know. And the organisation's credentials that have been assigned to this user have now been splashed all over the internet. With a federated approach, again, the service provider is still asking the same question, but as we know in federated approach, the user logs into their home organisation with their username and password, and it's the user's home organisation that says, yes, you have a license to access this content and you're a current user at this institution. And that's asserted to the service provider, and they find out precisely what they need to know. In taking this approach, the user's personal identity and data are kept between them and their home organisation. The publisher finds out precisely what it needs to know, and the distribution of credentials is kept to a minimum. So, Vector, on behalf of the school sector in the UK, carried out workshops based on federated access management technologies, wrote strategy papers and did a laboratory test. They then funded 2 pilots of the Shibboleth software in the West Midlands network and the London Grid for Learning network. In the HE and FE sector, the JISC funded a Shibboleth development support service, the SDSS Federation, which is the test development federation that was set up in the UK. JISC also funded a number of early adopters of the Shibboleth software to try various implementations of Shibboleth in various different scenarios and to provide case studies and feedback to the education community. Shibboleth was selected individually by both JISC and Vector as the most suitable option for access management solution. At the same time, there was, and it still is, government steer in the UK towards producing collaborative services to avoid the duplication of effort and resources. And it was widely regarded that UKERNA were in the most suitable position to host a federation on behalf of the education network in the UK. And we were given agreement to proceed with a joint approach in March 2006. The aim was to produce one federation for the whole of education and research, but we put the caveat in that if the requirements differed significantly between the schools and the HEFE research sector, then we would look at deploying 2 federations, but as a last resort, really. The benefits of a cross-sector approach were fairly clear. By providing a single federation for the whole of education in the UK, users potentially from the day they start primary school to the day they leave university can use the same mechanism for accessing their online resources. It also enabled us to pool the available experience and expertise in the shibboleth area at the time, and I have to say that back in 2005 in the UK this was fairly limited, so this was quite a bonus for us. There are significant economies of scale for both sectors in taking a single federation approach, and of course there's lots of opportunities created for sharing content and for collaborating between the sectors. So hopefully that explains a little bit more about the background to access management in the UK. I'm now going to talk about the Federation service. So what is the UK Federation? Well, essentially all it is a set of rules that binds members to make accurate statements about themselves to other members of the Federation, to keep the systems, the servers that they use to participate in the Federation and the data stored on those servers up to date, accurate and secure, to use personal data correctly in conjunction with the UK Data Protection Act, and in the event of any misuse or any problems, to endeavour to resolve these within the Federation in conjunction with the Federation operator and other members rather than by legal action. The Federation was launched in November 2006 for the whole of the education and research sectors in the UK and for any organisation, commercial or otherwise, providing services to these sectors. It's joint funded by JISC and Vector on behalf of the schools and HEFE sector, operationally managed by UKERNA, and two main groups make up the technical and policy framework of the Federation. The Policy and Governance Board is made up of representatives from the funding councils, from JISC, from Vector and from UKERNA, and they oversee the rules of membership document, the document that all members of the Federation need to sign up to, and any changes to that document. The Technical Advisory Group is made up of technical experts from the education community, and their remit is of the technical specifications and recommendations of the Federation. These are the key service features of the UK Federation that UKERNA provide: a discovery service in the form of a resilient waif, the hosting of the metadata, a monitoring service of service providers and identity providers to ensure, among other things, that IDPs and SPs are using the most recent versions of the Federation metadata, a test environment for organisations to test their IDP and SP implementations, and the Federation website. We also provide guidance, examples and support on how to comply with the rules of membership, how to interoperate with other members, help in planning the transition from existing access management approaches to Federated Approach, experiences of early adopters of the shibboleth software in the form of case studies and workshops and software downloads. Support is provided in the form of guidance and advice to identity providers and service providers on joining the Federation. There are configuration guides, we're hosting training courses, regional briefing events to raise the idea of the federated approach, and frequently asked question lists. The policy framework is made up of 5 key documents. Rules of membership is the only mandatory document and must be signed by all members who wish to participate. The other documents are advisory and focus on technical recommendations and specifications, and also how to meet the various data protection and privacy stipulations within the UK. So, as I've mentioned, the rules of membership must be signed by all organisations taking part, and it sets out the basic contractual framework for achieving trust within a federation. It covers things such as specific rules for identity providers and service providers, data protection, user accountability, etc., etc. User accountability within the UK Federation is optional, but it's something that we recommend identity providers sign up to give service providers the reassurance that in the event of any misuse, this can be traced back to individual users if necessary. And it requires identity providers to keep logs for a minimum of 3 months, and this is flagged in the metadata. The second document recommends how to comply with the legal requirements of the Rules of Membership and also the Data Protection Act, which references 8 data protection principles. Obviously, having the school sector as part of our federation, we are dealing with children under the age of 18, and for those individuals, the Act states that it's the responsibility of those collecting or using data concerning children to inform responsible adults, obtain valid consent from them, or prevent inappropriate use of data by those handling it. It's not something that the Federation operators are able to have much control over, but we can make these recommendations and reference the Data Protection Act. The document also recommends a core set of attributes to both minimise the processing of personal data and facilitate interoperability within the Federation. These are the 4 recommended attributes, with some information as to why they're recommended and how they should be used. You'll notice that the Data Protection Act mentions that the use of eduperson principal name and eduperson entitlement, it may be possible to determine an individual's personal data from those, and so we make clear that the extra burden involved on IDPs and SPs with using those particular attributes, and for most applications a combination of scoped affiliation and targeted ID should be enough. The third document specifies the technical architecture for the Federation and the participants of the Federation, and it contains choices of software that identity providers and service providers can use. Providing it's SAML compliant, it's been tested by the Federation and obviously it works. We're quite happy with the choices that individual IDPs and SPs make. We try and make it as non-prescriptive as possible. This document also includes a section on future directions for each area of work in an attempt to allow organisations to plan ahead in anticipation of any future directions that we're thinking that the Federation and its technologies may go. The fourth document is how the UK Access Management Federation achieves trust, and the fifth is the procedures that UKERNA operate to, and it covers things like the enrolment procedures, the CA qualification processes, support, and monitoring and auditing. So, in taking a cross-sector approach, we are faced with potentially a huge federation, and that obviously presents itself with a number of potential scaling challenges. To give you some idea, we're looking at between 12 and 18 million eligible end users. If we reach that potential, then we're obviously looking at hundreds of member organisations and hundreds, if not thousands, of entities. One particular problem with a typical shibboleth model and scaling is created by user discovery. You're looking at potentially a drop-down waif list that would disappear well off the bottom of the user's browser. So in many cases, and certainly in the school sector, we've seen the use of institutional portals to avoid the waif altogether. And we also recommend that service providers carry out their own discovery. And this often works very well because service providers usually know who their community of users are. They know who they've got a license with, who's eligible to access their content. Science Direct, Elsevier Science Direct does a particularly good, I think, service provider discovery for a number of reasons. Firstly, it doesn't mention shibboleth anywhere, which hopefully avoids confusing the user. And it also, as you can see, just lists the organisations that have a licence to access content that it provides within the UK Federation. And as you can see at the moment, there's just 5 of those, rather than 555. For all other situations, the Federation provides a central waif as a backstop. The production waif servers pull information directly from the Federation metadata to populate the waif list. These are hosted on 3 identical machines, spread across geographical locations within the UK to provide resilience and redundancy, and SSL is used as an anti-spoofing measure. This is what our WAIF looks like. At the moment there's only about 60 members in it, so it's not too daunting, but we're looking at things like sector-specific WAIFs, regional-specific. We're also looking at ways of using IP addresses to provide hints to the user as to where they may well be coming from to improve the user experience, and things like the use of Kerberos. To give you an idea of some membership statistics and membership update, as of Friday, we had 62 full member organisations that signed up to the rules of membership. There are still 5 more migrating from the Development Federation in the UK. You can see the split there between IDPs and SP entities. In terms of the software being used, 88% are using Shibboleth 1.3. There's a few still using 1.2, although that number is gradually diminishing each month. And in terms of the amount of new members that we're seeing, the last 3 or 4 months we're looking at about 3 or 4 new applications per week. So we're quite pleased with the take-up that we're getting. So, as I said, the Federation was launched in November 2006, and we're now moving into what we're calling Phase 2, based on a development roadmap to enhance the user experience and provide additional functionality. Some of the things we're looking at a bit further down the line, to be honest, are federations of federations, the EduGame work that Diego was talking about yesterday, federation peering. We're having discussions with Internet 2 based on the memorandum of understanding that UKONA has with Internet 2, convergence of local network and application sign-in in the pursuit of single sign-on. And we're also having talks with the National Health Service in the UK and other publicly funded bodies such as libraries and museums to see if we can bring them into the Federation and increase participation. So finally, in conclusion, I just wanted to say that yes, the Federation's launched and that's great and we're all very pleased about that, but this now gives us lots of potential to exploit, as I said, in the form of enhancing usability, providing additional functionality and increasing participation. So unfortunately, we're now not able to put our feet up and relax. The real work's just beginning. So I think in terms of the way the Federation is going to go, hopefully things will only get better as we start to investigate the additional possibilities. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening, and any time for any questions.
Okay, yeah. Are there any questions?
Mark, 2 questions. If the National Health Service engages, would they be a separate federation? And the second question is, what is the take-up within the e-science community?
Okay, answer to your question. Your first question, from what I gather, the talks that have happened so far with the National Health Service talks about utilising the existing federation and then participating within that. UKONA have an NHS coordinator who basically sits between us and the NHS, and that's certainly the message that I'm getting so far. E-science community at the moment, unless anyone wants to correct me, I'm pretty confident in saying that there hasn't been much take-up to date.
Thanks. UKONA is contracted to provide this service by JISC. Is that the model?
JISC and Vector.
JISC and Vector.
We're funded by JISC and Vector.
Do JISC provide any stimulation or any support for institutions in subscribing to the service, in enrolling?
In terms of just signing up, or in terms of deploying Shibboleth at their organisation? Yeah, the latter. Yeah. At the moment, I think the answer to that is no. It's something that we're looking into, UKONA. The model that we tend to adopt is to fund experts within the Janet community, and that's something that we're putting a proposal forward to implement. Otherwise, it's the Internet 2 list and what have you at the moment for organisations within the UK. But I think we've had quite a bit of feedback along the lines of some dedicated support for deploying Shibboleth at an organisation is required.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if you can comment on the situation with respect to IDPs across the three sectors, and also with researchers that sit within government research organisations, so are outside the university sector.
Sorry, what situation were you?
Well, really, I'm really focusing on do organisations run their own IDPs to a level, particularly in the schools and the further education and government research?
Sure. In the school sector, for 99%, I think, of the cases, it will be the local authority or regional broadband consortia that operate the IDP on behalf of the schools. There, I think there's about 110 LAs within the UK, so they will act on behalf of the 30,000 schools that are in existence. There's also the option for either sector to outsource their IDP function, and there are a number of companies in the UK that are popping up now offering outsourcing to academic institutions and research, of course. Does that answer your question? Patrick? Okay.
You mentioned that scalability is really a challenge for the deployment, and you also mentioned that you're supporting different Shibboleth implementations. Wouldn't it be more easy to just support one Shibboleth implementation to cope with scalability and rollout?
Did I mention that we're supporting multiple Shibboleth implementations?
Well, it seemed to me yes.
Oh, right, okay. This is probably we recommend Shibboleth, but I think as I tried to convey, we providing it is SAML compliant, then but I mean the recommendation we make is fairly in favour of the Shibboleth software in terms of it's the recommended one, it's the supported software. So and to be fair, we're seeing very few organisations that aren't using Shibboleth. So.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We will now have a presentation from Ingrid Melve. She's Chief Technology Officer at Uninet, and she will give us more details about the presentation, more details about the interconnection of the Nordic federations.
Thank you. This is mostly policy, and I was recently told that people who write policy understand just 10% of what they're told. So feel free to have that in mind while you prepare your questions. What I'll present is a experiment and some work that we are doing between the Nordic countries. Something we call the Kalmar Union, and the policy we developed for that, so it will be heavily geared towards the policy. Something about the cross-federation model we're using and how we're doing it. A little bit about the technical solution, but I won't go into detail on that since that was presented at the last Nordinet conference, and it's all in the paper and you can get the reference of Google and go see it yourself. Speak a little bit about what happens when you cross from one federation to another, or crossing from one circle of trust to another. Who are the participants in this? Who are the players that have a role when you start interconnecting national federations? And then there are some very important principles on consent. Don't do anything you don't agree to. And attributes, and a little bit about future works and what's going to happen later. The first Kalmar Union was ruled by a Danish queen called Margrethe I, and this is known as somewhat of the Nordic Golden Age, the only time the Nordic countries have been united under a single union. All the countries gave up their sovereignty, so they had the same monarch. However, getting any Norwegian or Swede or Finn or Dane to give up their independence is really hard work and wasn't achievable at the time. And that is the same basic idea that rules our Kalmar Union. Yes, there's some kind of guidance, there's a minimal set of rules, but we're not giving up our independence. It would be really hard to do. While mentioning the Nordic countries, I'd like to also mention that Iceland is a Nordic country. They have not been part of the Kalmar Union testing so far. What we wanted to do was to interconnect the Nordic authentication, authorization, infrastructure federations. And if you have been reading Liberty Alliance documentation, we are using the term federation in a somewhat different way. What we looked at was what is the model we have for exchanging traffic. And it's fairly simple. It looks a lot like BGP. Either my users want access to your services or your users want access to my services. And those are the two only cases we have to deal with so far. When we start doing attributes from multiple sources, it gets a bit more complicated, but for the time being, this is it. And it's simple. And I can decide if your users can access my services, and you can decide if my users can access your services. So we looked at what the simplest solution was for interconnecting access control. Actually doing the login and doing an attribute release. And at what the policy issues were for federations. What is in place and at the federation level already, and what do we need to regulate when we put two of them together? These are the principles that found the basis of our policy. Minimal information disclosure, informed consent. If we're doing something with your information, you should know about it. And you should preferably have the option to stop us from doing that by either not logging in or something else happening. Of course, if not logging in means you cannot do your job, you do have a problem. If, for instance, you're a Norwegian scientist and you're very stubborn, as some Norwegians are, and there's this Finnish site you don't trust, which is really stupid of you, and you need to go there and do some experiments before you can finish your doctoral thesis, and you refuse to do that for privacy reasons, that will have consequences. But such is life. If you don't do your job, that will have consequences, as it should. What we also say is there should be voluntary participation in cross-federation. This goes both at the personal level, at the organizational level, both on the identity provider and the service provider side, and at the federation level. So we have these three layers of voluntary participation where you can opt out at any point. No liability, because liability is just too hard to do. And some of the federations involved have a no liability clause. One of them does have a clause that takes on liability in the case of gross misconduct. However, in the case of gross misconduct, you can always sue them. You can try. You probably won't get any money, but you can try. And you can always do that no matter what the contract says. So what we did was say, liability, no, not between these. This is a best effort thing. And we also set up a suggestion for conflict resolution by an elected board. There's some people who get elected by the federation participating, and we go to them for conflict resolution. And there's nothing in there about property rights. They're really, really minimal. There aren't that many central components. Basically what we're saying is if there is a central component, some of us will take responsibility and that will be ordered for that component. Finished. Policy isn't that difficult, you see. Also, when you do a service across the border and there's an information flow, you need to make sure where the jurisdiction is for what's happening. So that's also regulated in the policy. And we go with the same thing the internet has done with success for so many years, best effort. No SLA, no guarantees. We do as well as we can. If my federation goes down and the Finnish users cannot access my services, too bad. On the other hand, they know that I have a very high self-interest in getting my federation fixed because, among other things, handing in all my travel statements will go through that federation. So if it's not up, I won't get my money back, just to cite one example service. And any kind of money flow is outside of our scope when it comes to cross-federation work. Yes, there will be contracts between service providers and identity providers, between service providers and parts of a university. For instance, the medical faculty at one place will probably have a contract with the service provider, but that's outside the scope of the work we're doing here. That's something that they can talk about. It's a bit like you have a gang of friends and two of them are in a relationship that's getting more and more cozy. It's none of your business. Let them do what they want. Well, as long as it's legal. So what we did was we based ourselves on bilateral agreements, and yes, we know that it doesn't scale. So we have a fallback clause where we can have this multilateral, someone new joins, we send around the agreement, everyone signs. Works fine. It scales up to the size of the Nordic countries and probably up to the scale of some more countries. We have a cross-federation charter which goes into details on what is regulated and how it should be. It's just a memorandum of understanding, and the version 1909 is up at the web, and you can have a look at it. It's pointed to from the paper that you'll find in the session webpage. We also choose to have overlapping federations. There are parts of the federations that would probably not want to be cross-connected. In the case of Norway, like the UK, we have schools in our federation, and we know that there are additional legal issues yet to be explored with regards to minors giving consent to transferring data out of the country. So the easy solution to that is just, well, no, the schools don't cross-federate with the Finns and the Swedes and the Danes for the time being. There are also service providers who will definitely not want to have foreign users. I don't know if you've run across people like that. Foreign, no good. And there are service providers like that because they have a limited constituency of some kind. And that's fine too. And what we've done before, and what sort of forms the basis and why we could do this, is we looked at each other's federation policies, and they are pretty much aligned. They are not the same, but they are similar. And on most of the important points, they look pretty much the same. So, and also there's a sort of a, how to say that, same cultural understanding of what things are between the Nordic countries. There's not that much difference between Norway and Sweden and Denmark when it comes to culture, at least if you compare with other places far away. We've all been ruled by Sweden. And also we've been working together for a number of years in something we call NOMIS, the Greater Nordic Middleware Symposium. So the people involved know and trust each other. And it sounds lame, but it is one foundation for trust, because what a cross-federation policy is really trust management. And when you know the people, you know that, oh yeah, maybe this is not perfect, but probably we can talk to Mikael and it can be fixed. Or I can talk to Torbjörn and he will ask me to do something and we can work it out because we trust each other as a community. Also, we've been doing work on semantic interoperability. The Finns use SHAC and Funet EduPerson, which is based on EduPerson. The Swedes and the Norwegians use NorEduPerson, NorEduOrg, and NorEduOrg Unit, who are also based on the EduPerson, EduOrg, EduOrg Unit schemes that come out on the internet too. And since we've been discussing this and since we're working together, we know pretty much what the differences are. And it's well documented by all the federations how the different schemas are supposed to be used. We also know that a student in Finland is not the same definition as a student in Norway. However, the differences are slight enough and there is documentation available, so you can tell a service provider that yes, a student in Finland is slightly different. Go to that web page and look at the definition. If you're not satisfied with it, don't join the crossing. If you're satisfied, it's fine. So who are in? Well, the federations, Haka in Finland, FEDE in Norway, SWAMI in Sweden, and DKAI in Denmark. DKAI was part of the technical trials we did. The four federations are in different sort of maturity stages, which is why I divided them into two. And then there's one participant that we tend to forget sometimes, which is the end user, but it turns out they're really important. And their opinion must be heard, and they must be taken into account when you design the policies and the guidelines and the way things should work, or the way things actually work. And then, of course, there's identity providers, or in the case of FEDE, home organizations, that is university, colleges, schools. Service providers of all kinds and colors and shapes. And this is what the Kalmar Union looks like. Let me see if I can get. Is that pointer here? This one? Yeah. The nicely colored in the color of the season, I've been out shopping before I draw the picture, is Haka. And they have service providers and IDPs. They run shibboleth, so it's just the normal average shape setup. Then you have FEDE, which is slightly different. We have one larger IDP. And then we have service providers. And what we do is we leave some of the service providers in Finland out. We leave some of the identity providers out. We leave some of the service providers in Norway out. For instance, the wiki for the FEDE steering group probably won't be cross-federated, just to mention one service provider. And then we leave some of the end users out through the fact that the identity provider here is not, well, can segregate between the ones who join and the ones who don't. And we use Samuel metadata for the federation overlap. So the intersection here gets joined with the normal FEDE data as seen from the FEDE side. And the same thing in Haka. They just add in the stuff that should be cross-federated. This also gives us the opportunity of distinguishing between the two directions. My users access to your services, or your users access to my services. And yes, it gets slightly more complicated, but it's still doable, and the people running the federations are really smart, so we can do this by hand. It was pointed out yesterday that this data, this metadata, is not that dynamic, because this is the part that has signing keys and who's an IDP, who's a service provider. It gets updated about once a day, and that's manageable, and we can provide each other with data. On the technical side, we did a trial interconnect in September, which worked fine. We were quite pleased. It was easy to use. And we also evaluated the EduGain bridging element, which is backwards compatible with Shibboleth 1.3, which is not yet generally available, but we have preliminary tests running, and most of us are participating in the EduGain work. So that's one way of doing it. However, we chose not to move forward with the EduGain bridging element at this stage because it was easier for us to just do the overlap and not have any gateway or proxy involved. All gateways lose information. Some do it more efficiently. And we also figured it would be easier to do a pure Samuel 2.0 based interconnect. So we're eagerly waiting for Shibboleth 2, which apparently comes out real soon now. We've been hearing that for a while though. What happens when you cross a circle of trust is that you have your user, and he wants to access a service in another identity federation. And first thing is to find the right login service. What federation are you from? Explicit links. There are many ways of doing that. And what's really transferred is that the identity provider sends the login and the attributes. And the service provider must trust a third-party login, which is outside of his trust domain. Because what a federation is basically a trust domain. And if you know the service provider in there, you know that they were vetted by someone you trust. If you move outside to another federation, it's not that clear. So you need some kind of trust mechanism here. And as I mentioned before, we have an opt-in at all levels. The users can refuse to log in. Their organizations can decide that, no, my IDP is not joining here. And the federation can say, too much trouble there, we're pulling out. You may also have opt-out at the cross-federation level if needed. Most of the basis of what we did when we interconnected was based on the assumption that if you have consent, if people are willing, eager, and over 21, then it's okay. In this case, if you're willing, it's okay. So we're a bit slacker than the normal procedures for who's willing. But if you said it's okay, it is okay. We trust you. A bit like if you compare Windows and Unix, it's not press OK to continue. It's more like Unix. You get what you ask for. Informed consent is important, and it's not easy. The same thing with the main thing you need it for is attribute transfer. And you need to safeguard yourself at 3 levels. At the user level, so the user has some way of finding out what's being transferred, what kind of information is being transferred. At the IDP level, so that the IDP can control what is really released. You don't give up more information than you should. And at the federation level. So the federation rules and regulations regulate the federation. That sounded really stupid, but it's true. And it's important to keep that in mind because you don't want to add another layer of all those rules and regulations that you have inside the federation. So we looked at what was inside the federation and the rest was okay. You have voluntary participation. And as I mentioned before, we have at least a certain level of semantic interoperability. And we do it by providing information about the semantics, not by enforcing the semantics. That would be impossible. Future work. Levels of assurance aren't mentioned. They should be there. They were in the paper. We don't know how to do levels of assurance between federations. In our case, we don't know how to do it within the federation, which may explain why we can't do it cross-federation. There's also single sign-on and informed consent. I log into the web portal at work, and suddenly there's another service, mailing SIMPA, mailing lists. They also have access to information about me. Well, they have access to my email address. And if you do single sign-on for the convenience of the user, there's no way to flash up what really happens, and you wouldn't want that. It's bad usability. And that's something we need to work on, how we inform users about single sign-on and what the consequences are and how to present the user interface. Hopefully some of the work that has been done on card space and user-centric identity can be reused in this context. Also, we need to set up a operational service because we had a test service and we need to go operational. And that really depends on the introduction of Samuel 2.0, probably on the introduction of Shibboleth 2.0. And also we need to revisit policy after they've had some real life experience. Because sometimes things break and then you need to go back and fix them. And that was it.
Thank you, Ingrid, for this very interesting talk. Are there any questions?
Am I allowed 2 questions? My first question is, some of the countries participating are in the EU and some aren't in the EU. Has that presented any problems?
No, because the only country that's outside is Norway, and we subscribe to all the rules and regulation, and we pay our dues, we just refuse to be members.
Okay. Is Iceland in the same position as Norway?
Yes.
It is, okay. And my second question was, have you had to normalise the your sort of enrolment processes for service providers and identity providers in terms of collecting metadata and, you know, validating that these people are who they actually say they are? Or are you just trusting each other that you are enrolling people to a sufficient level of trust?
When you say enrolling people, do you mean enrolling IDPs or actual end users?
Oh, sorry, IDPs or service providers.
Yeah. What we do is we say we trust the procedures of the participating federation. That's regulated by internal procedure in the federation. All the federations have their policies online, so you can go in and see what happens to them. With regards to enrolling identity providers, in Finland, they do a self-declaration. In Norway, we do a checklist with them. So Finland has that information public. In our case, it's not public, but it's gone through by someone outside their own organization. So we have 2 different procedures there, but we consider both of them good enough, especially since the checklist looks very much like the self-declaration schema.
A couple of centuries before this Kalmar Union, the Nordic countries brought some other services to Europe, like burning down houses and stuff like that. I was wondering if you have some advice for us on this apparently so easy policy stuff in the Nordic countries, since we are struggling a lot with that within I would say the JRA5 space of things. What do we do wrong? What should we do differently, or are we just too different to get easy consensus? KISS.
Keep it simple. It's a very sound engineering principle and it holds for policy. The problem with policy is twofold. One is, as I started by saying, the people who write policy only understand 10% of what you are saying. So you will need to talk to them in small words. If we are doing policy, we probably also understand only 10% of what we're saying. So there's a communication thing that you need to spend some time on. And the second is some of the problems you look at turn out not to be so hard because some of them can be ignored. Like, for instance, I'm trusting sort of the social contract that exists between the end users, and I'm trusting the other federation to do stuff right because I know their policy. So there's a lot of trust involved, and you have to make some risk management choices. Where do we put the risk? Nothing is risk-free. We will all die unless Jesus comes back first, but in principle, we'll all die, right? And that will happen sooner or later. And this policy work hasn't killed anyone, which is great. I mean, compare it to the National Health Service they were talking about. They kill people all the time by doing mistakes. We have an easy job. And we should get on doing it.
Ingrid, I was just wondering if you have some statistic on the access of the interfederation services from, I mean, in terms of users, of course.
It's not operational, and we don't have many users. We just run it with test users.
Okay.
Because we're waiting for software.
Jerif? Software. Okay.
So I guess we can look forward to your policy document, to take it as a prototype for the edugain policy then. I think that would be a nice idea. I also think it might be a bit easier than in the edu-Rome case, I guess, because there are less things to rule. No, Diego does not agree. But I actually have a question. As Haka is running Shibboleth and you are running the Liberty Alliance in FIDE. We actually, for that case, can also offer to use the edugain components. Is this something you are considering?
Yes, it's something we are considering. But we decided to do something that's simpler and get it up and running so we could have a technical trial just to get the experience and look at what we needed to get done, because otherwise we would have to wait until we had implemented the edugain, which we're in the process of doing, and edugain is important for us. But we needed that experience before we could move on to the policy work. And if we don't do that, we probably won't have policy experience we can feed back into edugain. So it's a sort of a incestuous thing.
Perfect for me.
Only one remark. I assume Andreas is working involved. No? Just when you make this like this, I feel like Andreas feeling like this, so it's okay.
Okay, thanks again, Ingrid. Next presentation is from Ken Klingenstein. He's the director of middleware and security at Internet2, and also chief technologist at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He was very much involved also in the development of Shibboleth, and now he's going to give us a presentation how things are going with federations in the United States, and more details about the In Commons project there. Okay.
So I'm all that's between you and going back to real life, so I'm going to try to make this pretty fast. I do want to point out one thing, as one of the old geezers in this crowd now, going back at least to Antalya, we've come a big distance, and I think everybody in this room really deserves a round of applause, because 6 or 7 years ago we were talking about, oh, technology this and technology that. Now we're talking about deploying and building applications on top. So we have come a long way, and I think we deserve some credit for that. I would also say that many of us in this room like to innovate and invent, and the people who pay our salaries really don't care about innovation and invention. They want services. And so I'm going to try to pull us into the service piece, because I would like to get paid next month. Let's see. because this is the last talk, there's a couple of just pictures in here to keep it light and simple. And I'm supposed to say money every other word, but there's only one use of money in here, so I'm sorry about that, but so it goes. So I want to talk a little bit about the activities in the US, in the R&E sector, in the government, and then a quick SHIB update since people depend upon some SHIB information. And then I want to spend more time on the frontier, because the frontier is very interesting at both the infrastructure level and, as Philippe pointed out, really where the action is going to be happening going forward is at the user and application level. So I just thought I'd begin by the picture of the frontier taken from at least my house. So this was the winter solstice. That's looking out towards the mountains and the frontier. And I want to begin with the government sector and then the R&E sector. Before I do that, I think I have a picture of Diego and Bob in their Western wear. Well, or maybe it's this one. These are not particularly happy people, so let's go back to that one where at least there's a hint of a smile. But yes, it took a while to get Diego into those furry pants, but he liked them after a while. So, government federations. Internationally, as we've heard, there's several national governments that are developing federations of agencies and offering services to external users. And within the US, there are several national governments working to do this. There is not, when you go inside the big road that surrounds Washington, D.C., there is nothing that holds things together at that point. So all of the agencies work on their own, and it's very strange. So we have, we've been working with the GSA, which is the collection of all the federal agencies. And then because agencies kind of every 2 weeks go, nah, we don't want to deal with all the other agencies, we're also dealing independently with several specific agencies. And that's a URL to a very interesting story that talks about how federations are starting in the public sector. So the e-authentication effort that we are working with the federal government, there is a coordinating agency. And it's based upon SAML, it's based upon Nist 863. I think one thing that's really fortunate is that Nist 863 has become a pretty standardized document on how one thinks about authentication. There is a new version of it coming out shortly. It addresses, I think, one of the remaining holes in the authentication strategy, which is we know how to identity proof you. And we know how to give you the credential, and we know how you're supposed to do that repeated active authentication, and you forgot your password. So how do we identity proof you? So that is a very standard activity, and so we better cover that in this trust model because it is a whole, and I think it is addressed to someone. The applications that the federal government are looking at range from booking campgrounds to checking social security information to filing administrative data to student loans to lots of different things. I should say that in working with somebody who works for the federal government, this woman described working with the federal government as a lot like coaching her little girl's soccer team, which is that you coach them, you get them kind of trained, they get out there on the field, and everybody runs to the ball. And then the ball goes over there, and everybody runs to the ball. The US, working with GSA, has been just like that. Everybody runs to the ball. So it is not a good soccer team, but it is the US government. And at least they're trying to form a soccer team. Yeah, yeah. And we are attempting to do a peering relationship within Common. And I'll talk more about that in the frontier issues. We have a lot of state university systems, since it's a big country, that are forming federations. There are 17 universities in the state of Texas. They have formed a federation. It is production. It has been production for over a year. I'll show you some of the applications they run. The same with California, the same with Maryland. And some of these are going to service millions and millions of people. The California Federation may reach 20 million people by the time they're done. one thing that's very interesting, and we'll come up to this in a second, is we do not have precision yet in our own language about when we're talking confederation, peering, and another concept that I want to introduce that some of these state federations are using called leveraged. And so we need to tease these apart because they're not quite the same. So here at the University of Texas, this was as of about a year ago. It's all kinds of applications that they're running on here. They're all federated. Every weekend they bring up another application or two. A lot of these are administrative. There is wireless access though, and a few others in there. And there is in fact, the Blackboard, the student learning system is now integrated into this. So another picture of the frontier, because we're moving now into In Common. And In Common is the US R&E Federation. It's a 501c3, which means that it is a nonprofit. It addresses a lot of the issues that Ingrid and others have specified, and Mark. We've got about 50 members. I think we're up to about 54 or 55 now. That is a small percentage of the amount of national SHIB use. There is a lot of SHIB use. So what happens? Why don't you join the Federation? Well, the contract. Pure and simple. So we are working through that. But we have experiences where the lawyers from MIT take the contract, mark it up, take out 3 words, send it to us. 3 months later, we get to it, we look at it, we go, okay, we can accept it. We send it back to them, and they cross off the words that they put in and put the original ones back in. Because it's billable hours, and we all know that if you're a lawyer, what you're really looking for is the ability to charge. So it is a frustrating process. There's the membership as of about 3 weeks ago. I would point out that in the concept of leveraged federations, notice all the University of California schools that are members of In Common. They are also members of UC Trust, which is the UC system, the University of California System Federation. So they're members of both. And we don't have a peering relationship because they think the peering is going to happen at the national level. And so they have adopted everything in Common, and then they add certain semantics and syntax that's in addition, and a few other requirements. But this is leveraged. Everybody belongs to one federation, and then they add a few other characteristics that make them a superset of the original federation. And I think this model is something that we're going to see a lot of in the US. Part of the reason for this is that their cost really isn't an object to joining In Common, et cetera. You'll notice that much as Elsevier belongs to the UK Federation, it belongs to In Common, it belongs to a lot of other things. Elsevier hasn't complained yet about having to pay $750 a few times. They seem to have enough money for that. But I think we will have to find out some kind of strategy where a single content provider can join one federation and have that extended across. So we use SHIB 1.2 plus, other possibilities in the future. And I think this is an issue that I know David Simonson has been wrestling with, and I know that it came up as well in the UK, which is, can't we use other kinds of federating software in particular? In particular, using WS Star, the mythical software from Microsoft that will become real. It's becoming real in various pieces of it as we speak. And the answer is sure, we're open to it. What we're concerned about is the size of the metadata. The metadata, when we start to have to carry metadata from WS and from In Common, even though or from SHIB, even though we know that the installations can work with each other, is the metadata getting big? Is the footprint of the software getting too big? And I would add to Ingrid's comment about bridging elements that we hear a lot from people about the complexity of installing SHIB, and they want it to be as simple as possible. We've got to keep that footprint small. When we added WS Fed capabilities to SHIB, that increased the size of the code base by 20 or 30%. just to accommodate that one protocol. So we have to be careful about this, but that said, Microsoft is an important player in life, and we have to do that. We have shared attributes in Schema, Eduperson right now. Again, relating things to the Microsoft side of life, just briefly, one of the things that Eduperson talks about is scoped affiliation. That's a natural in our community, because we often, I mean, in the commercial world, they assume that if you're saying member, it's member of that company. Well, in universities, you often have one university speaking on behalf of another, et cetera, and so we have the scoped member at so-and-so. Interestingly, and Ingrid can report on this, at the OECD meeting recently, the commercial sector agreed that the higher ed community was out in front in the ability to form shared vocabularies, syntax, and semantics for exchanging attributes. And so we are leaders in that space, and I think that's a goodness. That said, we often have to change this stuff. The great piece about this is that it is server-side versus client-side software, so it's not like we have to go to 6,000 desktops. We just change something back in the directory. We do levels of authentication. That's a very important issue for the US. And so we have a participant operational practices statement, and it's very similar to what you see in other countries. And now we're forming two additional federations, subsets of InCommon, called InCommon Bronze and Silver, that map to higher levels of authentication. We see some applications that require it now, finally. We've been looking and looking. Most the library content providers are so thrilled to be past IP address that they don't ask just how good is your active authentication. But we are now starting to see, at least from the federal government, of course, that. And then there's management, steering committee, and operations staffed by Internet 2. I think we talked about this. It's exactly the same structure that's used in the UK. What do people use InCommon for? Access to popular content, access to scholarly content. I believe in Switzerland now, Microsoft provides software using Shibboleth to download and to authenticate the users. There's access to external services. One of the things we've discovered is that when you graduate the university, in addition to getting a diploma, you usually get a license plate frame that says, you know, University of Colorado or something or other. So big deal. But what we're discovering is that if you can sell the fact that you can keep your login at the university after you leave the university. You may not be able to get to the same content depending upon the contracts, but you can have a login that says University of Colorado forever. That is turning out to be a very big sale. It's better than a license plate frame for selling this stuff. So it's good. And then we have access to national services, the National Science Digital Library, and the TerraGrid pilot. So what is hard about this in the US? Well, we have too many lawyers. If anybody needs a few, we have many to give. We have too few business drivers. We have no national bulk content licensing. What JISC had to build on was just a tremendous lever. We don't have that lever. We don't have many national applications, and we still don't have a government access yet to government applications. In some cases, it's more natural for universities to begin to think about forming a state federation versus a national federation. We talked, as Ingrid said, about bilateral relationships. And when you get down to it and you go to most universities and you say, so write down your policies on identity. Thank you. Yes, yes. Sometimes they laugh even louder, but they always laugh. So getting the policies in place is not easy. So just a quick sidebar about SHIB. As we said, 1.3 is widely deployed. Along the way, we added a few other capabilities. Microsoft paid us to add the ADFS capability, the WS Fed, and the federal government certified the software. This is a case of the federal government not knowing left-hand, right-hand. So we were funded by NSF to develop some of this software. NSF is a strong supporter of open source software. So then we go over to GSA and we got this wonderful open source software funded by one of your agency members, and they go, open source. Anybody who uses open source has got to sign this waiver. And so we're going, wait, don't you like open source? And they go, well, not really. And we go, well, gee, the left hand of government does and the right hand of government doesn't. But I don't want to imply there's only two hands here either in the US government. Yes, thank you. So SHIB 2.0, as people have pointed out, completes the SAML and SHIB integration. We all need to thank Scott Cantor a tremendous amount for tying this all together. Scott will say that when you ask Scott, is SHIB compatible, SHIB 2.0 compatible with commercial off-the-shelf SAML products? He says it's going to be more compatible with them than they are with each other. And I think that is the case. And if you have not sat down at a SAML 2.0 piece of software, you can begin to see the differences between SAML in its basic form and SHIB in the metadata, if nothing else. So you're sitting there at the SAML command line and you need to enter the metadata for each and every site, and you know, it's ugly, whereas in SHIB you just drag the file in, punk it down. So its SAML is almost point to point. It's TCP to IP. When we did TCP, we made sure that it was multi-point stuff. So we had the multi-point federation, we had the ARPs, etc. And the alpha came out in April. We sent it to, the first place the alpha went was to a security site to test for buffer overflows and all kinds of other security issues. So this is the Georgia Tech Research Institute, and they're finishing that up. I believe the beta is due soon, but as Ingrid said, I've been saying that now for a while, but I believe real soon in this. I would think that at the end of this month, in fact. Don't know. We have to give one person more coffee. So it also supports the attribute ecosystem, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit more in a minute. It can work with card space. It sets the stage for further work in multiple attribute sources, and I think somebody identified that that's one of the frontier issues. I'll come back to it. We are stunned at how we have taken PKI as a big piece of life and said, okay, we're not doing it for the end entities, we're just doing it for the enterprise. And that's really what hurts people still. So when we hear complaints about installing SHIB, almost all of them really come down to the PKI piece, and we've reduced it to as little as possible. So in 2.0, you don't even need PKI. You can have just raw assigning. You don't have to use any libraries or anything else. You can use PKI certificates. You can use plain keys, etc. But the trust management is a lot easier, and it's a product of years of painful experience. It's wonderful to have years of painful experience. I mean, it means we've come a ways. So we are starting to see the applications happen, which was really what we were about in the first place. So it's mostly access control to content. The first SHIB collaborative apps are appearing. There's lots of wikis now that are SHIB, lots of digital repositories, learning management systems, federated instant messaging, code repositories, etc. There is grid SHIB happening. You heard about a version of that earlier from Christoph with the work with EGEE. I am envious that you were in production, because there is none of this stuff the grid SHIB stuff in the US has moved to production. We've worked out all the kinks, but it's very, we just can't get them to move it to production yet. We're hopeful. We're also looking a lot at SIP-based conferencing, SIP-based tools. And as we all know, and I'll come back to this in the frontier issue, it is very difficult to get people to leave the duct tape behind. You know, it's holding still, until it breaks, I don't want to do anything. And so it's been a problem. So here now we're on to the frontier, and again, it's good to be getting to the frontier. And so I want to begin by talking a little bit more about this peering sets of relationships, and then some other really interesting things that have come along in the last few months. So I think there's three different concepts here related. Peering is when we're going to sit down and we're going to work with FIDA and we're going to hammer out a set of relationships. We're going to handle liability. We're going to handle privacy laws, etc. I think confederation presumes you may have some peering fabric, but it adds some consistency among these federations together, so that I'm struck with the fact in the last few days I've been in a couple of different countries in Europe, and the road signs are consistent. And it's a set of nomenclature that nobody has mandated, or maybe it has been mandated, but it is added on top of this, and it's a consistency of use and symbols, etc. And I'm starting to think that that's what confederation really is, that it has peering, but it has some more issues involved in that as well to make the glue hold together a bit tighter among the countries. So we will never be part of the EU confederation. We will be peering with individual members there. Whether peering with the confederation makes sense, I don't know. And maybe you just peer within as one of the frontiers. And then there's these leverage federations that extend a common base. So is leveraging and confederation the same? I don't believe so, because everybody in a confederation is a federation of federations, or a group of federations, where a leverage federation is a group of members that have agreed that we're going to have some extra meaning onto it. But one of the big issues that we have, and we're going to be dealing with in a couple of months, is beginning to understand these terms and get some better issues there. We're going to have to deal with the multiple protocol issues. I think they may be getting easier. Again, I want to thank David for hammering on Microsoft. And it looks like that Microsoft is going to support the SAML token native. Is that correct? Is David still in the room? I can't see. Maybe he's left.
It was promised by Microsoft to the government of Denmark.
Yes. Yes. So that is exciting.
They do not support the protocol, they only support the token.
Right. Right.
The question remains which products or which pieces of Microsoft this is going to be. Because, you know.
Right. But I believe what is happening here, I'm hoping, is that Microsoft is realizing that there's an embedded base they need to deal with. And that is a good thing. We have to align our policies. We have to figure out about sharing the metadata. I think one of the interesting things, for example, in the UK is that the metadata that they carry, one of the things is whether or not you reassign your EPPN. This is Article 6, I think it is. It's a fascinating issue. It's very important for access control lists. You can't, according to Article 6, if you're compliant with Article 6, you do not reassign your EPPN for 2 years. Now, I bring that up for a couple of reasons. We need to understand these little metadata flags that each federation may have, and we don't understand that yet. I also bring that up to illustrate that when we start to talk about pairing, and this came up yesterday when Manuela spoke, dynamic versus static trust. We do not have a single instance at this point, except maybe the Kalmar Union, of negotiated trust between federations. Not one, static, let alone dynamic. So we do not understand really how this problem is going to work. And we really need to get enough peering relationships going that we can understand this model. And I would also indicate, in terms of dynamic versus static, getting a university to change their policy about EPPN is not a dynamic activity. If they do that at all, it will take them many years to get it done, and then it will never be undone, we hope. The way functionality, dispute resolution. So I've asked people at the UN already, what happens if there's a disagreement between the US and the UK? Where do we take it to The Hague? That's actually the answer that's being suggested, so we'll see. And then virtual organization support, because we were funded to do this initially by the National Science Foundation to support the scientists, to support the virtual organizations, and so we've got to come back there and do that, and these are international virtual organizations, and so we need to really work together on that. So this is, we have a group called ReFeds. I'm the guy in the tie over here on the right-hand side. Refeds is looking at some of these peering issues. What are the parameters that we're going to be peering on? Well, level of assurance is certainly one of those parameters, but fortunately, I think we've all adopted pretty consistent approaches to that, and that's very helpful. Attribute mapping is another issue that we're going to have to understand. When you say staff, I know that in the UK, it means a different term than it does in the US, and so we're going to have to understand these. The legal structures, how do we handle liability? I was thrilled to see that liability was off the table in the CalMAR. And then where do disputes get resolved, the metadata stuff, economics. So I did mention money once. And here the issue was fascinating in that the US government, when we were talking earlier about federation, came to us and said, so our model is that we're going to charge service providers for belonging to the federation. And part of what we're going to do with that money is to give it to identity providers because they're relieving the service providers of some work, which they are. So the check is not yet in the mail. It will probably never get into the mail, and if it gets into the mail won't be delivered. And then all the privacy sets of issues. So just for the old timers in here, a couple of weeks ago when I gave a similar talk, I referred to those lines between the federations as ribbon cables, and very few people remember what ribbon cables are like. So if you remember what ribbon cables are like, we can gum some food together, I believe. Okay. And then we want to, as indicated, we want to make sure that the VOs can span and derive services across a mesh of federations. And you see two different examples up there. You see in one instance, the VO is depending upon a VO service center within a federation. That was modeled somewhat after the eScience Service Center, and that's why I'd asked the question about the eScience piece. And then in other cases, the VO is depending upon each organization, with each member of the federation to provide certain services to their VO members. We don't see many problems in this. We haven't implemented it yet, but when you go to a campus and you say, you have some scientists that belong to the ATLAS experiment at CERN, and would you like to support them by adding this object class or that object class? They go, sure, that's cheap. It's just an object class. So we don't see much problems right now with that. But there is now the issue of developing the attribute ecosystem. So basically, SHIB is really about the deliverance of attributes from an identity provider to a service provider. It doesn't begin to address the issue of how did those attributes get into that service provider, identity provider. We have to start to address that. And we want to do this so that we can have a consistent set of user experiences, and it has to function in the real world, and this is a real problem. And so I'll give you an example of that. So here's life today. So today, I'm a user over there, and I will authenticate to my identity provider, and then SHIB will release the attributes to the applications. Notice down there I have the peer-to-peer trust flag. Again, as others mentioned, and as I'm about to dive into, we need to integrate this not just with the federated trust, but with the peer-to-peer trust, which is also getting traction in the world. So we have some GUIs that do this. We have your active authentication that you do to the IDP. And then we have a mythical tool called Autograph that allows you to manage the release of attributes. It is mythical in that it really isn't production level quality at this point. We are looking at 3 different instances of developing Autograph. The need is pressing because we are getting to lots of use cases as this stuff takes off where users go, hold it, this wiki needs to know who I am, and not just merely that I'm a member of the community. In fact, we had a challenge among members of the In Common group. How many people on your campus would know where to go if they needed an attribute release policy changed? And very few. There are 2 help desks that actually know how to handle that, though, at Penn State and at the University of Washington. So, now we want to get into the situation where we want to manage attributes as well as manage acts of authentication. And so we have some other tools that have been supported by the National Science Foundation that allow you to manage privilege as part of the identity management space. We are trying to keep the number of GUIs to no more than 2 or 3, which is probably the max of what most users can handle. So all of that is okay. We think we can make this work, and then you get to real life. And real life has happened. Nobody waited for us to get this done. And so there were portals out there. There were proxies out there. There were gateways out there. And these things help to make the world work. But from security viewpoints, as it was pointed out earlier, they are often very problematic. In a proxy instance, I have given my credentials to the proxy owner. Oh, I think I trust them. Actually, I don't know who owns that proxy server. So I don't know if I should trust them. In portals, there's all this cross-portal communication that can happen. And one channel can reach over the fence into another channel and look at the credentials there. So the security inside web browsers sucks. And so portals are problematic. And then you start to have flows of information. So currently in the grid space, I may have my identity from the university, and I may also have my identity from the grid space over there in the purple. And then I need to have some attributes that flow all the way from that identity provider, maybe through a VO service center, into a gateway, and then into an application space. So this is the attribute ecosystem. It is the flow of attributes from sources of authority to storage locations and identity providers, etc. We need to fill out this space. Obviously, WSF and other things play a role in this, but we need to have firm protocols for moving this stuff around. Okay, to move fast into this, the last set of issues. Internet identity has gotten very big. And one of the things in the internet identity space that's gotten very big is peer-to-peer trust. And you can pick OpenID as an example. You can pick card space and what Microsoft does with self-managed cards as an example. You can pick Higgins as another example out there. Why is this big? It's big because it's not infrastructure. I'm not dependent on anybody else to do this. And that's why you go to a developer and you go, well, you know, don't you want to use federated identity? Well, yeah, but boy, I can have this stuff done later today. And so OpenID is becoming very popular, et cetera. The use cases include file and photo sharing, some encrypted email. It doesn't have a lot of role aspects, but it has a large amount of personal trust in there. And as we start to take this stuff and look at it, there is a layering that is happening. And that is goodness, because in fact, we can integrate at various layers of the stack. So one of the things that's happening is that we want to integrate all your forms of identity in the internet, and we want to integrate the tokens so that you're carrying around your personal tokens and your federated tokens. We'd like the GUI to be the same, and we'd like you to have the same way of managing this stuff. And we'd like it to work as well in the privileged space. So where we're going with this, let me stop there, is that Microsoft has just, we've signed an agreement with Microsoft to bring shibboleth attribute release policies into card space. And what that will mean is that you'll open up card space and the WAIF function, which we all despise, from the very beginning we all despised it. One of the other ways of getting rid of it, besides IP address guessing, et cetera, is to create a card that's your identity, where you were from, and stick it into your card space. And that will be something very widespread. Where we'd really like to go is have a card that is an attribute release policy. Now, it turns out Microsoft doesn't know how to do that. If I pick a card in card space, all of the attributes that are listed on that card get released. I have no control over, I only want a few of those attributes released. So Microsoft is going back. We're going to try to help them figure out how to do this in the managed card space. So this is yet another example to how do we avoid the WAIF function, and we're excited about that. Again, we need the user interface to be the same, and cards, Higgins uses cards as well. So credit cards, business cards are the model for all of this stuff. We have talked to Higgins, and one of the instances of autograph that we want to do is on top of Higgins. Let's see, management of the domain is something else that we're trying to get to. Let me go to this last slide. I think it's the last slide, which is the collaboration tools and services. And I know that many federations are beginning to dive into this. I've been speaking to the Swiss, the Australians, and the UK. We're suddenly at the point where we can start to do cool stuff. There's a lot of infrastructure out there. And so we want to make these collaborative applications really work. The wikis, the IMs, web access, file sharing, and video conferencing. And the use cases are really interesting. So there's a case in the University of Wisconsin where they are discussing a new strategic plan for the campus. And they want only people who are members of the campus to be able to discuss this, and they want privacy in that. And can we do that? Well, sure, we can do that really pretty simply now. So we're moving ahead into these collaboration tools, and I'd like to believe that next year in Bruges, what we're really talking about is comparing notes on all the collaboration tools that we've developed and seeing if I mean, right now, 4 different countries shipped TWiki. I'd like to think going forward that we could only have 2 countries shibbolizing SIP, for example. So we'll see how that goes. So I'd just like to salute at the end MACE for their wonderful work in all of this stuff. I'm the dog in the corner here. And with that, to show you the rest of the frontier, that's sunset back at my house. That's not my house, thankfully, over there in the corner. But that's what the frontier looks like, and we should all be living there. And some of us maybe can travel back there soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're a bit over time. Before you close your laptops, don't forget to give your feedback on the session. And I don't know, there's still time for some questions. Are there questions? Don't hesitate. Okay. Thank you very much, Ken. And I hope to see you.